Welcome to this rapid revision session looking at the latest civil rights movement, focusing on the death of Dr. King and the civil rights movement between 1968 and 1975. Let's start by having a look at King's last campaigns. Here we see an extract from King's last ever public speech, given just the night before he died. "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." A typically impassioned speech, and one that might be sadly prophetic. In 1968, Martin Luther King launched another campaign aimed at improving living conditions in the North. Remember that his campaign in Chicago in 1966 had largely been a failure campaigning on these issues. If you're unfamiliar with this, I've got another rapid revision video covering it. The Poor People's Campaign was intended to have broad appeal, helping many working class Americans, though many of the issues predominantly affected black and other minority communities. To launch this campaign, King visited Memphis, Tennessee to support poor refuse collectors. On the evening of April the 3rd, 1968, King gave what would be his final speech. And after that, a very sad and very famous event. Now we'll have a look at the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On April the 4th, 1968, King was in Memphis, Tennessee. He was preparing to support striking rubbish collectors in another Poor People's Campaign. At just after 6 p.m, he was assassinated by a racist sniper, who was later captured and arrested. This photograph shows the immediate aftermath, with witnesses pointing out where the shot had come from. King is lying on the ground. So what were the outcomes of Martin Luther King's death? There were deadly riots in 172 towns across the United States. The Poor People's Campaign failed. King had warned that it would, and sure enough, it did. Civil rights group membership declined, especially amongst white people. Fewer white people were sympathetic to the civil rights cause. Other leaders simply didn't reach out to them in the same way that Martin Luther King had. More black people became militant. SNCC dropped the non-violent part of their name and became the Student National Coordinating Committee. And when it comes to white engagement with civil rights, it's important to recognise that Martin Luther King was almost uniquely talented in attracting white support. Very few other people were able to do this. What was it about King that appealed so much to white people who otherwise might not be quite so engaged in the civil rights campaign? Was it his Christianity, his rhetoric? It's difficult to say, but the results of his death were that, sadly, white support did begin to fall away in some areas, with some people claiming that black people have got the legal rights that they needed. But legal rights, as we've seen before, don't always translate into actual rights and improvements in the standard of living. But after 1968, there's going to be a new president. What would his priorities be? A new president, but does that mean new progress? Richard Nixon became president in 1969. He's best known for his policies on Vietnam, on which basis he was elected, and for the Watergate scandal, on which basis he basically was fired, or rather resigned before he could be. But this is what he did on civil rights. He gave funding for black people setting up their own businesses, which really fits with his Republican views that people should help themselves. He gave tax breaks to white-owned businesses setting up branches in black communities, hoping that this would have a trickle-down effect on the economics, providing both jobs but also opportunities and better facilities. He pressed for the deliberate hiring of black people to encourage equality. This is something that's known as affirmative action. And he also gave jobs to black officials. James Farmer, the former founder of CORE, became a high-level official in the Health, Welfare and Education Department. So these were all changes for the better, arguably, but realistically, how quickly would these things have an effect? Many would argue that actually the effects were too slow. So what was progress by 1975? Let's have a look at a couple of historians' interpretations, and then once we've done that, you can probably make your own mind up. Interpretation 1 is from The American Dream, published in 1996 by historian Esmond Wright. He considers the extent of progress by 1975. Despite the civil rights gains of the 1960s, however, racial discrimination and repression remained a significant factor in American life. Even after President Johnson declared a war on poverty and King initiated a Poor People's Campaign in 1968, the distribution of a nation's wealth and income moved towards greater inequality in the 1970s. Civil rights advocates acknowledged that desegregation had not brought significant improvement in the lives of poor blacks. Clearly, this interpretation is fairly negative about the progress by 1975, suggesting that it was limited or that, in some respects, things had actually gone backwards. Let's see how interpretation 2 contrasts with this. This is from The Civil Rights Movement, published in 2004 by Mark Newman. He also considers the extent of progress by the 1970s. By the early 1970s, the African American struggle for equality had made some significant gains. Between 1964 and 1970, the number of Southern black elected officials had increased from fewer than 25 to over 700. Racist demagoguery, which means political language and speeches, declined in Southern elections, and white candidates increasingly sought to attract black voters. In 1972, most Southern states had moderate executives, that means state officials, and moderate means they are not extremists. Andrew Young, who had resigned from SCLC in 1970 to enter politics, was elected to the US House of Representatives in 1972. A year later, Maynard Jackson became Atlanta's first African-American mayor. So this is a more positive interpretation of how things had gone by the 1970s, but let's consider the reasons behind them. When you read interpretation 1 carefully, it is much more about living conditions, economic welfare, and so forth. There, it's demonstrating that actually there hadn't been a great deal of progress, and in some respects it claims that things had gone worse. Whereas interpretation 2 focuses more on the political progress, showing that there were more black people in elected and powerful positions, and that there had been real progress in the law. So it depends what you focus on, really. Had there been progress by 1975? In terms of social issues, maybe not a lot. In terms of political issues, maybe some. What do you think? Let's have a look at some final points then. Martin Luther King's death was a watershed in the civil rights struggle. While Nixon took some action over civil rights, he was more focused on the issue on which he had been elected, ending the Vietnam War. Historians differ in their view as to how much progress had been made by 1975. On the one hand, there had been significant legal and political progress. On the other hand, social and economic inequality remained, and arguably remains today. That's the end of this rapid revision lesson looking at the latest civil rights movement. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Other than that, I'll say thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.